right, hi everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of Get Real webinars. Today we'll be sharing findings from a recent report released by CSSP along with Children's Rights and Lambda Legal called Safe Havens, Closing the Gap Between Recommended Practice and Reality for Transgender and Gender-Expansive Youth of Color or Youth in Out-of-Home Care. My name is Roslyn Ernie. I'm a policy analyst here at CSSP, and I'm joined by Curry Cook with Lambda Legal and Christina Remlin with Children's Rights. Our moderator, Jonathan Likes, actually had to step out for another meeting, so it will just be us today in a small group. So now kicking it over to Curry.
Hi everyone, this is Curry Cook from Lambda Legal. Happy to have you join us today, and we wanted to start out and make sure that this webinar was very youth-centered and youth-focused. So I'm going to share a clip from a current client of mine who is a transgender girl who is in foster care in Pennsylvania and is in a really good and affirming place now. Her name is Savannah, and she was actually featured in our Safe Havens report. And last summer she recorded a recording for us about her experience in care, so I'm going to play that for everyone. So hold on just a second and I'll get it set up.
My name is Savannah. I'm an 18-year-old transgender female. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and now live in Pittsburgh. I don't speak for all transgender people, but I hope sharing my story may help make things better for other transgender youth in foster care. My father is a pastor. My parents were, to say the least, not very supportive of my gender identity when I came out. There were a lot of issues between us that all stemmed from their lack of support in this matter. These family issues led to aggression and depression on my part. I'm not proud of many of my actions during the last few years that I lived with them. I was placed in a mental hospital twice in 2014. After the second time, the doctors realized that it might not be a good idea to send me back to live with my parents. So, in January of 2015, I was placed in my first foster home. My first foster mom knew nothing about transgender people, but she was willing to learn, and so I tried to teach her. Within a month, she had changed her mind drastically. Apparently, she thought I was too young to be thinking about anything even close to the word transgender. She thought I was a boy now, from now on, right down to my underwear. The entire time I was placed with her, she told me I wasn't a girl and it was wrong to be trans. It didn't help that the foster care agency through which I was placed had the exact same perspective. It was awful. I'm actually shaking a little bit now just thinking about how I was forced right back into the closet from which I had just been released. My last day living with my first foster mother was in June. We decided I should leave dressed as a girl. She thought it would be an effective act of rebellion against the foster care agency, and I because I was desperate for an opportunity to finally be myself again. Both of our goals were accomplished, however, temporarily. The director of the agency was furious with me because dressing in the attire of the quote-unquote opposite gender was against the rules. Ultimately, however, it was clear that no one in this agency would ever acknowledge me as a girl as long as my legal gender was male. Thus, nothing had really changed in that regard since I entered foster care. My new foster mom was not much better, but a step in the right direction. She didn't care how I was dressed, although the foster care agency still did, or how I presented myself. She certainly didn't see me as who I am, but she didn't try to change me. Eventually, CYS even gave me the okay to dress as a girl in public. The agency, however, provided a clothing allotment only for, quote-unquote, gender-appropriate clothing. I spent upwards of $200 of my own money to create a wardrobe that more accurately suited me. As time went on in this second home, I grew increasingly aggravated with my foster family, constantly calling me by my legal name and misgendering me. I repeatedly voiced this to my caseworkers, but nothing would be done because there was nowhere else I could go. One conversation during that placement that I find important to mention occurred between me and my foster mom. It was about how everyone in the household knew I was trans, and yet no one used the right pronouns or my preferred name. She had three excuses for this. One was that she had become accustomed to what she called me already. The next was that she called me what she called me was my legal name and gender, and she wouldn't change it until I had it legally changed. The final reason, the reason that made me leave the room without another word after she had said it, was that she wasn't going to call me something that you're not. She also told me I couldn't dress as female in her house because it would be a bad influence on her young children. Finally, a new place opened up. My caseworker made sure that I knew it was a miracle that we managed to find this home because not a single other foster family in all of Western Pennsylvania was willing to consider taking a transgender girl. I felt trapped. I didn't have enough money to go get my own apartment, and there are no other placements for me. I knew I couldn't even go to a group home if I wanted to. I wouldn't feel safe in a boys' group home, not to mention the horrible amount of dysphoria that I would experience if I was sent to one. And I knew I wasn't allowed in most girls' group homes, and the ones in which I would be allowed have long waiting lists. Finally, just last week, I heard that I will be able to go to a transitional living program, a girls' transitional living program. Everyone has a single room, so I can live there and be myself. I know that all of you represent children. I want to share with you that the only people in my case who stood by me were my attorney GAL and my attorney. They honored my identity, they treated me respectfully, and they even fought to force the agency to allow me to buy girls' clothes with my stipend. If they hadn't been there for me, I am not sure what I would have done. I'm not sure what you can do with all of this information, but I hope my story will help you understand what it's like to be transgender and in foster care. My name is...
All right, everyone. There's a lot in Savannah's story, and we're going to sort of throughout the presentation talk about some of the issues that she faced, both legal and non-legal. But I am happy to report that Savannah was accepted into the independent living program as part of a girls group home in Pittsburgh, and she's been doing great there and now has 2 part-time jobs that she's excelling at. So that's the good news, and I'll turn it back over to Rosalind.
Sure. So next, Christina's going to kind of orient us to the report and to our schedule for the day.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalind. This is Christina Rumlin from Children's Rights. So I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for participating in this webinar. One of the main goals and hopes that we had as authors of this project is that the report and the findings contained therein would really serve as a useful, meaningful toolkit for agencies and providers and advocates and stakeholders who are connected to TGNC Youth so that they can have a better understanding of the protections in place and ways to develop stronger protections for these young people to meet their needs. You know, in many ways, TGNC Youth are not do not have needs that are different from their cisgender, gender-conforming peers. They need to be safe and affirmed and live in a place where they're supported and they can sleep safely at night. Unfortunately, for many of these young people interfacing with the juvenile justice system or the child welfare system or experiencing homelessness, they're not encountering affirming environments. And one of the things that motivated this report was hearing from providers and agencies across the country a real desire to adequately serve these young people and a lack of awareness or understanding or training in terms of exactly how to do that. And so it's really our hope that this webinar and this report will help to kind of close that gap so that agencies and providers, stakeholders and advocates are better equipped to serve these young people. So we're going to start today with an overview of what we know with respect to transgender and gender nonconforming or gender expansive young people, what their experiences are, what are some particular risk factors that they encounter because of the lack of affirming environments and protections. And then we're going to cover the policy findings. So this report did a pretty comprehensive review, kind of top to bottom. So starting at the very top, we'll look at the federal constitutional protections and federal regulatory protections that are in place. We'll then look at state law developments and state-based licensing regulations as they pertain to these 3 out-of-home care systems. We will end by turning to a section on the practical pro tips. So what are some practice recommendations from young people and providers in terms of how to adequately meet their needs? There are several stories featured and youth voices that we were honored to feature in this report that really help us illustrate in very concrete terms how to address and tackle some of these issues in a productive and affirming way. So again, our deepest gratitude for participating in this webinar. We're really thrilled that you're with us today, and we hope that this information will be useful to you.
So this is Rosalind again, and a bit of housekeeping as we're going through this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use either the question box or the chat box, and we'll be answering all questions at the end. So we're going to start with what we know. And I know that a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are things that you already know. We just want to make sure that we're starting off on the same page before we kind of get into the policy findings from the report. So first, what do we know? How many transgender and gender-expansive young people are in out-of-home care? And one thing to note about when we're talking about LGBTQ, transgender and gender-expansive young people in care is that often we don't have accurate numbers. This is for many reasons. First, it's not something, we don't ask young people when they enter care about their sexual orientation or gender identity. We don't have data systems that are equipped to handle that data. It's also often something that young people don't feel comfortable sharing with caseworkers or intake workers as they enter care. And so when we're talking about the numbers of young people in care, often what we're relying on are representative studies. One great study that we use in the report is the Williams Institute study of the LA County foster care system, the largest foster care system in the country. And they found that 5.6% of young people in LA system were transgender compared to 1 to 2% of the general population. When they combine that with the LGBTQ population in LA County foster care system, they found that almost 20% of young people in foster care in LA identified as LGBTQ or gender expansive. That's compared to 5 to 7% in the general population. It's a huge overrepresentation. We also know that as we're talking about the foster care population, we have to recognize that young children and youth of color are overrepresented in foster care, and that overrepresentation tracks across the LGBTQ and gender-expansive populations in care. And another thing that we know is that young people enter care for many reasons, and many LGBTQ and gender-expansive young people enter care for the same reasons as their heterosexual and cisgender peers. But many more do enter care because of family rejection of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And so that's one thing to be conscious of as we're working with young people in care. And now I'm going to pass it over to Curry, who's going to talk more about what happens when systems fail young LGBTQ and gender-expansive young people.
Sure. Thanks, Rosalind. So I want to direct your attention to the slide that's up now, and just thinking about the cycle of entering into government systems of out-of-home care and homelessness that unfortunately affects so many youth in our society, but for a lot of reasons really hits LGBTQ youth, and in particular trans and gender-expansive, gender non-conforming youth particularly hard. So the slide that you're looking at, this cycle, is kind of on steroids for LGBT youth. So Rosalind mentioned that we know that at least a significant contributor of the overrepresentation of LGBT youth and trans youth in particular in care is rejection and associated abuse or neglect at home. But also we know that many young people who are, say, in like the 16 to 18-year-old range are often not picked up at all by the foster care system, and then may go directly from rejection to experiencing homelessness. And we also know that just being in foster care increases your likelihood of being in the juvenile justice system, and experiencing homelessness also dramatically increases your likelihood of being involved in the juvenile justice system. So for LGBTQ young people, and again in particular trans and gender nonconforming youth in foster care, often conflict around gender expression is what fuels involvement in the juvenile justice system. Or for, say, a trans young person who is in care and doesn't have an affirming or supportive caseworker and may not have an affirming attorney or CASA volunteer guardian ad litem like Savannah did, if they're experiencing bullying or harassment in school and don't have a parent, advocate, or caseworker who will support them, then that unsafe school environment may lead to juvenile justice involvement or push out from school, and combined with experiencing homelessness and criminalization of that experience can really fuel these higher rates of involvement in justice systems as a whole. And thinking about the additional factors piece, if you were, say, an undocumented youth or an undocumented youth of color or youth of color in general, then societal discrimination and stigma and prejudice as a whole can be hitting you on multiple aspects of your identity simultaneously. So one of the reasons that we talked about both the juvenile justice system and also the system for youth experiencing homelessness as well as foster care was because young people are overrepresented in all of those systems and cycle disproportionately high numbers between all of them. And Rosalind, you want to advance a little bit? I think we had some additional stats here. So this is from an older study, and I certainly hope, because of all the work that's been done in New York City, this is better. But at the time of this study, 78% of young people who are LGBTQ or experiencing homelessness had been removed or ran away from foster homes because of abuse or discrimination. And some great work done by Angela Irvine and others has documented that LGBT youth in the juvenile justice system are much more likely than their peers to have experienced abuse or neglect or out-of-home placement or homelessness. And if we go to the next slide, I want to focus in particular about how this cycle from child welfare to homelessness really has a different aspect to it for LGBTQ young people. And that is, we know that if we're kind of tracking what our prioritization of placements should be in the foster care system, from going back to your family of origin to then looking at kin or family as a placement to then foster care, and then going down the list as that tracks with our permanent plans of reunification, adoption, guardianship, or another planned permanent living arrangement, that we know that unfortunately this system fails non-LGBTQ and gender conforming youth to some degree because there's a higher incidence of kids exiting foster care to homelessness. But if we look at the bottom of this chart and think about a lack of services designed to promote family acceptance and to find affirming relatives, can lead LGBT youth to be placed into foster care and not reunified at higher rates. And then if we know we don't have enough affirming homes out there, then we really see an over-reliance on congregate care for LGBTQ young people. And if those places aren't affirming, that's when young people can run or get pushed out or exit from those congregate care settings into the juvenile justice system and end up in a more shelter or temporary placement. Many of those are not affirming themselves. Young people are not placed in accordance with their identity and then leave. And so thinking about how all this lack of services and affirming placements really increases the number of young people who exit from child welfare to homelessness. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Christina for the first part of talking about our federal law and policy as it relates to this population.
Thanks, Curry. Yeah, so I just wanted to start out this conversation by talking about my favorite thing, the Constitution, and how it provides protections for all young people, and in particular TGNC young people who are in out-of-home care systems like child welfare, juvenile justice, or those experiencing homelessness. So children's rights has been involved in a lot of case law developing and pushing the standards of constitutional protection for kids who are in state custody, for example, children in child welfare custody. And through this litigation and other excellent litigation by other esteemed advocates, it has really been fleshed out in the case law that children and young people in state custody have the right under the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment to be safe in care. And the way that safety has been interpreted is more broadly than just physical security. and reasonably safe living conditions. It's also been interpreted to include the freedom from psychological harm and from physical and psychological deterioration. And so that is definitely an avenue of rights that apply to these young people as they are in state custody. There are also equal protection claims, which provide that transgender, gender nonconforming children who should not be subjected to discrimination on the basis of their transgender, gender nonconforming identity. In particular, courts have held that transgender people as a class really fit into the kind of case law about equal protection because they have been historically subject to discrimination and differentiation, and because the defining characteristic of being transgender or gender nonconforming is kind of, as the courts discuss, an immutable or distinguishing characteristic, so not something that a person can easily shed. And so as a result of that, courts have really applied equal protection standards to discrimination based on a young person's gender nonconforming or gender expansive identity. So that's an important avenue to consider for these young people as well. In addition to that, under the Establishment Clause, these TGNC youth have the right to not be subjected to the imposition of religion in their out-of-home care placement setting. So for example, in a faith-based provider that runs a group home, young people have a right to not have a different religion imposed upon them. In addition to that, under the First Amendment, youth, and this applies to youth whether they're in state custody or not, have the right to freedom of expression, which can include not just speech, but in some cases has been interpreted to include other forms of expression, including how you dress. And so that could be a very important avenue for protection for these young people. Specifically in the juvenile justice context, in addition to these rights I've just discussed, there's an additional kind of layer of rights that have to do with the protections that young people who are in some kind of a detention facility, custody situation, have the right to. And that includes the right to receive adequate physical and mental health care, the right to religious freedom, the right to not be subjected to unnecessarily restrictive settings, and the result of their transgender, gender expansive identity. And so those are some additional rights that are available in the juvenile justice context. Finally, I think it's important and understand that when youth are in juvenile detention, they also have a right to be protected from segregation or isolation, because that would amount to a punishment in violation of their due process rights. So for youth that are in juvenile justice detention, the goal of their confinement is supposed to be rehabilitative. So they should not be in that context as an expression of any kind of punishment or punishing intent. So that's important to keep in mind. So those are just a few avenues of protections that are in place in the constitutional front. For youth experiencing homelessness, they're not in state custody, so that the substantive due process right to be safe in care that I've just discussed, the right in a juvenile detention facility to adequate treatment in that context, is not available in the same way for youth who are experiencing homelessness, because their accessing homeless services is voluntary, even though it's obviously brought on by a very serious need. It's not the same analysis as youth who are in state custody. And so for youth experiencing homelessness, they have the constitutional protections of equal protection, as we've discussed, and that First Amendment right to freedom of speech and expression, as we've discussed. And so those are still constitutional avenues that are in place for youth experiencing homelessness. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Curry to take us through some of the federal regulatory and statutory protections that exist for these young people.
Thanks. So I hope everyone's holding on to their desk because we're going to have like a 3-minute like flying through basically all the federal laws and new regulations that happened at the end of the Obama administration. So just want to mention that all of this is summarized in detail with cites in the Safe Havens report. So feel free to take a look at the report for more detail. But one of our aims in providing a really detailed overview of not only the constitutional protections, but also statutory, regulatory, and federal policy protections was just to make sure that both agency folks and advocates were aware kind of all the tools that they have in their toolbox to help push systems to do better by trans and gender nonconforming youth. And one of that was both to highlight some regulations that went into effect at the very tail end of the Obama administration that are still in place, and a couple that may be at risk, which I'll highlight. But it's also to highlight that the existing statutory scheme is, of course, designed in all of these systems, is, of course, designed to protect all young people. There isn't a carve-out or exception that LGBTQ youth should be treated differently in reality under the law. So thinking about on the child welfare side, first, Title 4E and 4B of the Social Security Act, which is the main provisions that set out and provide the mechanism for funding for the child welfare system, requires that all children be in a safe setting that is least restrictive and most family-like for them. Regulations require that agencies make reasonable efforts to both return children home or prevent them from removal and then return them home safely if that's a possibility. So those require are applied to all youth. And then also as part of the state plan, in order for an agency to receive 4E dollars, the plan must be in accord with recommended standards of national organizations, and also the plan must address the safety and protection of the civil rights of young people. So given that Child Welfare League of America and basically anybody and everybody that says anything about what's good for kids says that kids shouldn't face discrimination and that trans youth and other youth should be affirmed in their identity, basically if a state plan is not accomplishing that, or even if it says it is and it's not in reality, then technically states are not in compliance with Title 4E and Title 4B. And also the Foster Care Independence Act, or most commonly known as the CHAFE program, requires that youth have ongoing opportunities to engage in age or developmentally appropriate activities, and states and tribes must use objective criteria for ensuring fair and equitable treatment of benefit recipients. So that's another angle to use. During the Obama administration, a few notable regulations came out. One of those is the Health and Human Services Grant Regulation, which basically says that anybody who is receiving federal funds through HHS as it flows down to the state and their contractors must not discriminate against the beneficiaries, so that would be kids or families, on the basis of age, disability, sex, race, color, national origin, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So technically, if any kid or family in the foster care system is being discriminated against, it's contrary to federal regulation. Also, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act explicitly prohibits discrimination based on gender identity or sex stereotyping. So to the extent that a child, for example, is in a psychiatric residential treatment facility or other hospital or residential treatment type setting that receives federal health care dollars, Medicaid dollars, then they're protected from discrimination under the Affordable Care Act. Also, I'm sure many of you have been following along the development of Title IX as it applies to educational settings and prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. Even though the Trump administration withdrew the GOJ guidelines, Title IX still exists, and courts around the country are consistently saying that discrimination on account of gender identity is discrimination on account of sex. So any sort of program that's also receiving federal education dollars in the context of a residential program, Title IX may apply there. So in the context of the juvenile justice system, quickly, I did want to note that both the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and also the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act do contain sex as a protected class in their non-discrimination provisions. So thinking about using developments in Title IX and other areas of the law, Title VII in the employment context, interpreting sex as being inclusive of gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination may again be a helpful tool in that context. On the policy front, really important to note that at the end of the Obama administration, the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice issued some recommendations to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that basically said they should be having state advisory groups, state juvenile justice systems, develop non-discrimination provisions and training, and ultimately begin data collection in those systems. So it remains to be seen under this administration how much of that LGBTQ work is going to continue, but we certainly hope it does. On the runaway and homeless youth front, a very significant development was the promulgation of the Runaway and Homeless Youth regulation, which requires anyone receiving Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funds to not discriminate, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, to provide training and to collect data. And then folks that are receiving funding for runaway and homeless youth programs through housing and urban development, there's the equal access rule, and then also the equal access rule in accordance with an individual's gender identity, which again basically will require that trans and gender expansive folks should have access to facilities in accordance with their gender identity or that's most affirming to them. Under the Obama administration, all of these agencies did a lot of work on affirming LGBT folks, and we've definitely seen an erosion of that in the Trump administration, most notably around data collection and just sort of erasure of the presence of LGBT folks and information in that work. So if you have concerns about that or have been experiencing that with clients and families that you serve, definitely let us know about that, and it's something we're definitely watching closely, but we want to make sure that you know that all of these federal laws and regulations are currently in place and provide protection from discrimination. I'll turn it back to Rosalind now.
Sorry, actually, Curry, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk through some of the state law.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so that was sort of our federal overview. But turning to state law and policy, basically we also wanted to make sure that people knew that in addition to the constitutional protections and federal law protections that exist everywhere, that lots of states have moved to increasing explicit protections in state law and policy, and we certainly encourage that. And I just recently got a question from someone with a state child welfare system that was like, well, why? And the why, I think, is because we know that the Constitution and just general non-discrimination protections can be really sort of amorphous and vague for people who are both caseworkers in the system or kids or families. So the more explicit we can be of basically saying, no, you can't be discriminated on because of your sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, and then have policy that spells out in detail what that means, and then have training that backs up that policy, then the clearer and more definite and more real those protections actually become for folks. So those like explicit protections, both in child welfare, juvenile justice laws and statutes, regulations, and also agency policy are great. And then also some public accommodation statutes or human rights laws or ordinances in certain states also may apply to, say, for example, a juvenile detention facility or a group home or a child placing agency as they provide a service. So it just kind of depends state to state, but that may be another tool. And Rosalind, you want to move to the next one and I'll talk about the maps. So both for the child welfare and juvenile justice system, we basically provided, and you can link to these from the Safe Havens report, or they're available on Lambda's website and also on CSSP and Children's Rights, but a categorization of different states in terms of having explicit protection. So the states that are in purple are actually states that have detailed LGBTQ-specific policies, which we recommend that all states adopt. And those include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes in the non-discrimination part of the policies. Then the green states actually have sexual orientation and gender identity protections either in statute, regulation, or agency policy. The kind of yellowish golden states actually just have sexual orientation and sex as protected classes. The blue states just have sex or sex is a protected class only, and then the other states basically have neither or none. So if you go to the map itself, the interactive map, you can actually click on the state and it'll show you where the source or lack of source is for your state. Rosalind, you want to move to juvenile justice? Yeah, right. So you can see sort of similar categorization. You can see the legend at the bottom for where states fall in the juvenile justice front. One thing I forgot to mention, the federal law piece for juvenile justice was the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So that has actually resulted in some states having information about LGBTQ young people, which sometimes does include explicit protection from discrimination in agency policy and a prohibition on sexual assault and sexual harassment. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we've seen states in the juvenile justice context thinking, well, that's enough and they don't need to do more in terms of explicit protection and training around making sure youth are affirmed in the juvenile justice system. Definitely let us know if you see something that we're missing or if you have questions about the maps and our source there. And I think that's all for that part.
Great, so thank you, Kari. Now we're going to get into another thing that we looked at for the report. We did a very in-depth study of all the licensing regulations in all 50 states in the District of Columbia in child welfare, juvenile justice, and systems serving runaway and homeless youth, looking for explicit protections or explicit language around sex or gender. So we looked at definitions, we looked at admissions procedures, sleeping arrangements, clothing, supervision, body searches, and training requirements. And I promise it's much more exciting than our report on regulations sounds. But one of the major things that we found was that despite the fact that every single state and the District of Columbia uses the term sex or gender in referring to sleeping arrangements or how clothing should be provided to youth or whether workers need to be trained on certain things, they use these terms throughout their licensing regulations, but only 5 states actually define what these terms mean. 3 states, California, New York, and Florida, define them accurately using gender identity as the defining component of gender. 2 states have a little bit more concerning definitions. So Tennessee defines sex as sex assigned at birth, and Illinois defines sex as the status of being male or female. And so one of the things that we found is that in the absence of clear definitions defining what these terms mean, the interpretation of their meaning falls to administrators or individual caseworkers. And as we heard in Savannah's story earlier, where she wasn't allowed to have clothing in accordance with her gender identity because of their interpretation of the state regulation requiring clothing to be provided in accordance with gender, that can have a very detrimental effect on young people and care. And so I'll pull out some more of the highlights from the regulation research that we did, but all of the regulations that we pulled are available in the report. There's a link to a very comprehensive chart with all of the regulations referencing sex or gender in all 50 states in the Safe Havens report. One thing that we found, and I'll just, again, highlighting the major findings, one thing that we found is that 3 states, California, Ohio, and Florida, require the provision of clothing in accordance with gender identity. Most other states require clothing to be provided that is appropriate to the sex or gender of the child, but don't define sex or gender. And then 6 states actually require child welfare workers, caseworkers to be trained on SOGI issues, so sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. 3 states, North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin, require training related to sexual development and human sexuality. And actually, Nevada, by statute, requires facility staff and foster parents to receive training on working with LGBTQ+ youth. So those are some of the major findings that we had in the report. I'd encourage you, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or on the question box, or to read the report. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Curry and Christina to go through some of the really interesting recommendations that we heard from practitioners and youth themselves.
Yeah, this is Curry. If I can actually just jump in with one thing I forgot to mention in talking about the state-based protections. That I'm sure many of you have been following this past legislative session, that unfortunately a few more states went into the category of having religious exemptions in the context of foster care. You can see on the child welfare map the states that are kind of have polka dots over them. So just since we published this report, Alabama passed a law that isn't as bad as some, and that it doesn't apply to child placing agencies that receive state or federal money. But Texas just passed House Bill 3859 that goes into effect in September, and like the religious exemptions in other states apart from Alabama, applies to child placing agencies and would allow them to, say, for example, turn away a same-sex couple on the basis of their religion or sincerely held religious beliefs, and may also allow them to refuse to care for an LGBTQ young person. I think we're particularly concerned that because so many trans youth, in order to be themselves, are of course outing themselves as being trans because the name they use is different than what's on a legal document, or their appearance is not conforming to someone's expectation of what they should look like given their sex assigned at birth, that those young people are particularly at risk of maybe not be able to be served in their communities or sent miles away to find an appropriate placement for them. So definitely, if you know of young people or families that have experienced this type of discrimination, please reach out to us, because we and other organizations are definitely interested in challenging those laws. And I think significantly we're very concerned about the chilling effect these types of laws have on LGBT people and same-sex couples stepping up to be foster parents, and also the chilling effect it may have on young people from just being themselves and remaining isolated, which we know contributes to so many awful public health outcomes. And obviously, when these child welfare systems are designed to meet safety, permanency, and well-being, staying isolated is not certainly in any young person's best interest or good for their emotional or physical well-being. So please let us know. Now I'll let Christina go and talk about some of the recommendations.
Christina, you might still be muted.
Uh-oh. We may have lost Christina somehow.
All right, we might have lost Christina. Our technical assistants are working on the case right now, but I can go back.
Okay. Well, actually, we can start with some of the tips from young people. So part of one of the things we really wanted to focus on with the Safe Havens report, but is not only just going over the legal schemes, including regulations Rosalind mentioned, but also really show how both the negative aspects of care have been affecting young people, but also knowing that more and more young people are being affirmed in care, or at least in some aspects of their care. So the young people that we featured in the Safe Havens report, while all of them unfortunately had suffered discrimination in various aspects of their lives, they also all had some aspects of affirming care, and we wanted to share their sort of positive place of what a difference it made in their lives to be affirmed in care, and also share some of their tips to providers. So I want to start with Sarah, who is from a state in the Southeast. And her story, I think, is really significant in that prior to and partly while she was in care, she was engaging in sex work to pay for hormones that she was obtaining from the internet. So through sort of working with her attorney who advocated on her behalf, she was connected with a qualified provider and actually began receiving hormone therapy while in care. And as she says, that engaged her or enabled her to quit engaging in sex work and helped her really achieve some stability. And eventually she was placed with one of the agencies that we feature in Safe Haven's CRIS 180, which allowed her to be placed in their girls group home program. That agency's done a lot of work on being an affirming provider, and specifically around having trans youth placed in accordance with their identity. And one of the tips she had as a part of being in that affirming placement was also just that there were still folks who needed to learn and grow and come to appreciate some of the nuances of what it means to be transgender and how to better work with youth. And so she learned that it's good to sort of give folks time to understand and be patient with people, which I thought was just an amazing observation from a young person in care, that sort of self-reflection of I also need to give people time. And she was also placed in a couple of psychiatric treatment facilities, and she engaged in self-harm that were definitely not affirming. And so one of her recommendations was that agencies should screen all of the placements and make sure before they put kids there that they are in fact trans affirming. So other tips on the child welfare front from Savannah that you heard from initially, her point, which I think is really well taken, is that when she was working with non-affirming workers, there were things going on in her life that weren't necessarily related to her identity that she didn't share. And she didn't share those things that were going on because she didn't have trust in her caseworkers, and she didn't have a good relationship with them because everything ended up resulting in a fight about her identity from her perspective, and so she just didn't share. And of course, that's exactly the opposite of what we would like to promote for youth in care, to share and build trust so folks and systems can better meet their needs. As she said in what she spoke about in the clip we shared, is that obviously the harm that she was supposedly being removed from was replicated in care. And she also wants to make sure that youth are clearly explained when they come into care about their rights. Rosalind, when you go to the next one. So Jennifer, who is also in care in a southern state, she recommends that folks develop affirming placements. You can read her full story in the report, but she was actually placed out of state because no place that met her level of care that she needed at the time would affirm her. So she was completely uprooted from her community and placed miles and miles away from her community in a residential setting that was affirming to her, but was still really challenging because the support that she had in her community was not accessible to her. And also when she was in some residential facilities, they were not affirming to her, and in fact sometimes would call her pronouns that she didn't use as a means of punishment, and obviously that was not good for her well-being. She was, however, ultimately placed in some LGBT affirming housing that opened up, and her recommendation is that you really affirm identity in all aspects because she saw what that looked like and what a difference it made for her. Lydia was in juvenile justice facilities in Texas for a couple of years, and basically was blamed a lot for being victimized and attacked because she was not presenting in gender-conforming ways, and in fact was told by caseworkers and managers that she should be, quote, more like a boy, and then she wouldn't get beat up or harmed so much. And that one of the great things that she says, which just totally cracked me up, was that actually affirming trans youth is good for the environment. And what she meant by that was she had to file a lot of grievances about her time in care, and as she put it, she could have saved a lot of trees if they had just done right by her to start with. But I think her broader point is basically that, you know, using your resources to affirm youth actually makes the entire environment and facilities safer and makes it better for all youth. When she got out, her really affirming aspect of her care was having a parole officer who was affirming and supportive of her, and that let her focus on the things that she needed to do to successfully get off parole, which she has done, versus having to always worry about how she was going to be treated and how things were going to go with her parole officer. And just briefly to wrap up some other things, Muhammad, one of the young people that was served by a family acceptance provider, basically had affirming healthcare provider, which meant a lot to him and helped move along in a positive way in his care. And then Barrett, who was in a shelter for youth experiencing homelessness in Spokane, their shelter basically eliminated like the gendering of restrooms and floors based on recommendations for young people, and also had a very open environment where if someone was experiencing bullying, it was clear that you could sort of intervene and trust folks. And Barrett was also connected with an LGBT youth service provider in the community, and that meant a lot to him. So I'll stop there. I think we may have Christina back.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. I apologize for that abrupt departure. It's nice to be back with you again. So we had a wonderful opportunity to really feature some pro tips from providers who are doing this work across the country, and we thought we'd just feature a few of them in the little bit of time that we have today. From the Ruth Ellis Center, which is a tremendous center that serves youth experiencing homelessness in the Detroit area, they had a couple of very practical recommendations, and some that are even focused on you know, how to leverage funding and existing contracts in order to expand the amount of this work that you're able to do as a provider. One of their first recommendations was to create requests for proposal and contracts with LGBT-focused nonprofits. So look to build those coalitions in your community to the extent that there are other agencies and nonprofits doing the work. Another aspect of their recommendations included looking for optimal referral sources. So if there is just a very easy way for existing LGBT nonprofits or other organizations to provide referral services to you, basically it's a very important avenue for you to seek out to make sure that these youth are really able to access the whole array of services that are available. They actually also recommend developing relationships with the child welfare and the juvenile justice agencies, and through those relationships looking to leverage private and public funding. And so there's a lot of grant applications or foundation applications that are made more appealing by partnerships and collaborations like that. And so really kind of look out for those opportunities. And so I think that's a great set of recommendations. They've been doing this work for a very long time, and so it's really great to hear from them in terms of the practical bent on how to not only get the work done, but keep yourself funded and the lights on as you're doing it. We also featured Chris 180, which is a provider that, similar to Ruth Ellis Center, has a very historic reputation as being an LGBT affirming provider, and they were actually one of the first in the Southeast to do any kind of this work. And so they basically have a lot of a real practical tip with respect to licensing. So one of the things that can be confusing for providers as they're trying to navigate how to best serve these youth is, are they officially authorized under the licensing provisions to place a youth in accordance with their gender identity or in the setting that that youth would feel most safe in. A consistent example is, I have a transgender young woman. I would like to place her on the girls' floor, but I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble with the licensing department of, the agency if I do so. So Chris of 180's kind of innovative and a little bit outside the box approach to that was just to reach out to licensing directly and say, hey, I've got this young person and here's what I'm going to do. Is that okay? And there, here the licensing, reaction was do what you think is best. And so they really felt that they had a certain authorization in that way, and they were able to proceed in doing so. So don't be afraid to proactively reach out to licensing and take advantage of those relationships to get some clarity about your practice. They also have a very elaborate set of components that they look for in their hiring process to make sure that they're hiring individuals who are people who believe in equality and who are LGBTQ affirming. I think that's a pretty important thing. In a lot of agencies, you'll have a real need to make sure that your hiring process is really kind of screening in people who have a perspective that is going to be supportive and affirming with respect to these young people. And it's a component of your kind of obligations as a provider, whether it's federal constitutional obligations or state law or regulatory obligations, as we discussed today. Those obligations to keep children and young people safe in your custody really extend to your hiring practices and making sure that the young people are not exposed to individuals who will convey harmful, hurtful, and psychologically damaging messages to them. So hiring process, critical step in improving practice in this area. Finally, and I think this is one of kind of the most exciting and important notes in this entire conversation, is that there needs to be training with respect to these issues, and it kind of needs to be early and often. And none of us, myself included, none of us should operate from a position of thinking that we have learned this set of information already. We should all be in a position of embracing the humility, and that this is an ongoing learning opportunity. And so in the context of staff training for agencies and providers, even attorneys, attorney agencies that are serving young people and other stakeholders, initial training and ongoing training is really the key component, because there are things that are going to arise as individuals are doing the work that are going to flesh out the need for some more training, and they're going to flesh out the need to sort of revisit issues. And so that was one of the really tremendously exciting and optimistic, hopeful things that came out of our conversations with Chris 180, is just their real commitment to that ongoing training component, because every single staff person is not going to get this right, and they're not going to get it right, after one training. And, all of us are pretty imperfect human beings. And so we really just need to buckle down and embrace that, and embrace the opportunities to learn and learn again and learn again, and then learn some more. So those were some of the pro tips that we just wanted to emphasize. There's more detail in the report, so please feel free to dig into that. And if you, in your practice, really have some additional tips and pro tips and insights that you'd like to share with us, please feel free to reach out to us, because we're always really excited to hear those stories and have the opportunity to take advantage of those insights.
And this is Curry. I'll just add that one of our goals with featuring the providers that were doing affirming work is that we wanted to share kind of provider to provider tips. So knowing that there are folks who are successfully doing this work out there means that you can take the good stuff from them and adapt it to you, and don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but know that it really is happening out there.
Great, thank you both. So now we have about a half hour left for questions. Just a reminder that we will be sharing a recording of this webinar and a copy of the Safe Havens report with all participants. And we've had a few questions roll in throughout the presentation, but if you have any additional questions, please input them into the question or chat box, and we'll be sure to share them. So one first question that we received, how would the ACA repeal affect transgender and gender-expansive youth in care? Which is a really great question. I might kick it over to the lawyers on the call first before taking a stab.
Yeah, I'll start. This is Curry. I'll start first, and then Christina, feel free, of course, to add anything. I mean, I think the ACA, a repeal could just have sweeping, dramatic, and awful effects on LGBT people and of course, people living with HIV significantly that, overwhelmingly rely on Medicaid funding and other federal dollars to provide needed care. So we're in particular very concerned about that, and I think we are really only beginning to appropriately address the needs of young people in care in terms of thinking about addressing the risk for transmitting HIV in the foster care population, given the overrepresentation of LGBT young people and young people of color, given that both of those populations are at such high risk. So I think thinking about any repeal of the ACA on the HIV front is frightening, to say the least. And then I think we're only really beginning to see how the protections of Section 1557 could be utilized by trans and gender-expansive people in the context of health-related activities. Just to give you an example, a call that Lambda had on the help desk line was from a mother in Georgia whose son was engaging in self-harm and wanted to have him, a trans boy, admitted into a psychiatric facility to make sure he was going to be safe. And facilities found out that he was trans and were turning him away, and we worked with her to craft a letter citing the protections under Section 1557, which she sent to the facilities who turned him away, and then suddenly got a call back from some of the facilities saying, oh, you must have misunderstood. Of course we'll accept your son. So that's just one small example, I think, of sort of shifting the understanding of what the obligation of health care providers are. And so I think the repeal could have some really, really damaging effects just in that regard of just pulling back what was finally resulting in some progress in healthcare providers understanding their obligation to affirm identity.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered the major risk factors on that front. I mean, from all of the service provision components of it, including the access to mental health care and Medicaid, there's a lot that's on the line. I mean, to the extent that the ACA is repealed and we would then lose that prohibition on discrimination, as we've been over, there are multiple other avenues to fight discrimination, not the least of which is the Constitution itself. So, we can keep up the fight, and we will. And there are very good bases on which to do so. But it would still be a tremendous loss on that front. And I think, as Curry's spelled out, there's a lot of very serious and dire ramifications on the health provision front as well.
Great, thank you both. Another question that came through is how can child welfare systems best handle pushback or resistance from staff, providers, foster parents, etc.?
That's a good one. That's a really, really good question. I mean, I think one of the ways that we have had some success in having this conversation is really by talking about kind of some of the safety components that implicate that arise with these young people, and really helping to do some training so that staff people understand that what is gender dysmorphia, and therefore understand what are the psychological consequences of forcing a transgender young girl to dress as a boy and to not have access to the kind of grooming that she prefers, and what can be those dire consequences. I mean, we've seen in our experiences the self-harm and then the suicidal ideation that really can come up when youth are really experiencing that trauma really underscores how urgent and how significant it is. So I think that the training and youth voices is a really good approach. I mean, I also think that there are faith-based providers that have a significant amount of resistance to this. There are also faith-based providers that are tremendously affirming, and so in some ways, in our advocacy work, we like to draw on those aspects of people of faith as well, and hope to leverage some of those relationships to improve the education and understanding. But I think that it's really, it starts and ends with education and training, and I don't think that we may not bring everyone on board, and some people may be so resistant that no amount of information and training or youth voices or those kind of collaborative meetings would help. But in our experiences, we've had some real cause for optimism in conversations, and have certainly observed people coming to a better and more accurate understanding of the needs of these young people, and therefore getting on board with affirming treatment. But you've hit the nail on the head on a very big component of what I think the challenge is, and a real need for more education and more people working on this.
Yeah, and this is Curry. I would just add that I think it's always helpful just to center this discussion in what the obligations of these systems are. I mean, obviously in child welfare, it's safety, permanency, and well-being. And so all the things that we're talking about today and are present in the places that have more detailed LGBT-specific policies are all about achieving those goals for this particular population, which as Christina mentioned, have the same needs as all youth, but because of their unique experiences in life and needs and care, do need some specific attention and work. And so in thinking about the fundamental goals that a system is supposed to be measured by and achieve, if you're not achieving that for 20% of your population, then you're not doing too good of a job. And of course, I think now we can cite to federal laws, and I think like the Child Welfare League of America, for example, is working with the Council on Accreditation to make sure that as part of the accreditation, child welfare agencies are supposed to be complying with CWLA's Blueprint for Excellence, which requires that agencies have non-discrimination provisions and affirm youth and work with same-sex couples and LGBT people. So I think we have all those to pull on. I do think that sometimes we need to get back to the real basics, which is that we are supposed to be in our work providing the youth and families we're working with basic dignity and respect, and that means recognizing them as who they are, not who we think they should be. So, so I think it's always important to center these young people and families as human beings that they are, and that's why they deserve respect and affirmation, and then all these other things about why the systems exist and what their goals are, and also now, more clearly what the law requires, even though the Constitution's always required that, as Christina mentioned, are all important. And finally, I would just say that I think as we have more and more young people who are bravely out in their systems, like they're, really changing the hearts and minds every day, and in fact, like changing the law. A trans boy in foster care was very active in getting, making sure that laws that affirm LGBT youth in care were passed in Nevada this session. So I think things like that are really changing the game and causing people to understand better why they should be affirming.
Great, thank you both. Another question that came through was about conversion therapy. Have you seen an increase in conversion therapy bans going around the country, or have you not? What's the state there? And I'll let you guys go with that one first.
Yeah, this is Corey. I'll go first on that. I mean, I think that we have, just this session, and I give a big shout out to NCLR and their Born Perfect campaign, and a lot of other organizations that are really, been working hard on increasing the number of states who have conversion therapy bans in place. I believe it's in New Mexico, Nevada, Rhode Island, I think is in passed, and Delaware's in the works, and I think Connecticut this year. So I may not have that list exactly right, but we've definitely seen an increase in the number of states that have a flat-out ban. And then also in the process, in the context of a lot of these LGBTQ-specific policies that we mentioned, there'll be a portion of the policy, which we certainly recommend including, that says any attempt to condemn, pathologize, or change a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity is prohibited. And that's especially important. I think that we haven't necessarily, or don't see as much in the context of these out-of-home care systems, the extreme end of like sending a kid intentionally to a conversion therapy kind of shop or organization. But what we do hear a lot of is folks in, say, a group home setting or other situation, either using faith-based reasons or just whatever their own personal beliefs or stigma or prejudice may be, to say that young people, it's their fault, they're in care because they're LGBT, that they're going to hell because they are, or those sorts of things that are basically an aspect or form of conversion therapy, even if they may not be the extreme version that we hear about. And even in the extreme version has been successfully challenged by the Savannahs Poverty Law Center using a consumer fraud theory. So I think that there are definitely some progress in understanding how damaging that is on the state front, and some novel legal challenges that are helping push that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would say that just for me personally, I've heard of a lot more of conversion therapy camps that operate in the private sphere. So that young people are sent to, by their families that are not connected to state custody, children in state custody. And I think, as Curry mentioned, there's, I think we're always working on ways to challenge conversion therapy in a variety of ways, and so we're certainly thinking about that. And I think that I don't know if there's been an uptick in that kind of conversion therapy camp that serves just private clients, or if I've just heard more about them in the last couple of months, but I definitely have.
And I think we're also kind of seeing an evolution slowly but surely in some places of understanding that attempts to pathologize or harm kids or mistreat them or try to convert them by parents are kind of resulting in actual findings in the context of a child welfare petition. Or that if a child is being threatened, say, by one parent to be sent out of state to a conversion therapy camp, that would it be possible, for example, for a concerned friend or relative to file a guardianship of a minor petition to allow that child to stay in an affirming place or remain? I mean, that can be challenging for many reasons, but I think there is an increased recognition by judicial officers that hear kids' cases about the damage of conversion therapy type activities. And so the more we can help educate people about how harmful and, of course, unsuccessful that they are, the better. Going to be in part of young people. And I also think it's an area where there's a lot more research would be helpful too, particularly around trans and gender-expansive youth, about just how damaging the attempts to suppress gender identity or expression really are for young people.
Thank you, Curry. I'll just add too that we've seen a number of cities enacting conversion therapy bans. Cities and counties, I know Cincinnati, Miami-Dade, and Seattle all have enacted conversion therapy bans. So we're seeing that pop up like on the smaller scale. It's not just a statewide action. We've seen it happen on the smaller scale. Another question for the lawyers in the room. Have you come across a need or an opportunity to work with judges on this issue?
Yeah, this is Curry. Definitely. We're going actually this Sunday. I'm going to the National Council of Family and Juvenile Court Judges Conference in DC to present a workshop on working with LGBTQ youth, and I believe the National Juvenile Defender Center and the Equity Project there has actually been working with the National Council on Family and Juvenile Court Justices on a kind of bench guidelines or bench card. California has an LGBT bench card. The ABA Center on Children and the Law with their Opening Doors project that was going several years ago put out a bench card. Washington State has had a whole series of community meetings and action plan that's involved the judiciary to do a better job on behalf of LGBTQ youth. New York City Family Court is working on an LGBTQ bench card. We've done a series of trainings with judges in Florida, and I know others have been involved in trainings. Kansas is actually convening, the state court system there is convening some trainings around working with LGBTQ youth. So I think we've seen a real shift in recent years of the judges that are hearing cases involving child welfare and juvenile justice of really stepping up their game on this front.
Great, thank you, Curry. And this is our last question. What other resources would you recommend sharing with advocates in my jurisdiction? I'll let you guys take this one first.
I think that one of the things that we really tried to do throughout the report is to feature existing policy and practice guidelines and regulatory components where we feel like states have really gotten it right or are really good examples. And so I think that we have kind of cited to those resources in the report and, with an eye towards making those available. I always think that New York City's Safe and Respected policy and practice manual is really, really helpful and a very good kind of comprehensive guide in terms of how to better serve these young people. And so I think that that's probably a good starting point. I mean, there's a tremendous volume of resources with respect to best practices in this space that are out there. And that was one of the things that kind of motivated our interest in focusing this report on referring to those best practices, filling the gaps of information in terms of what were existing practices, and then really providing some practical pro tips about how to get this right. And so I think the report kind of cites to our favorite documents with respect to the best practice pieces, not the least of which is the best practice manual that was created by Lambda Legal and the CWLA. But yeah, Curry, others?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I think the having all these resources there, particularly if you go to the interactive maps, you can actually, a lot of the documents that Christina has mentioned are there, and also in the resources at the back of the report. So those are really helpful because they're at a great stage where you don't have to start from scratch if you're looking to have a policy in your jurisdiction. And also, I think we've really seen in some states where we and others have been involved in getting together working groups or task force or whatever you want to call them together on both a local or state level, how that can really result in both policy change, but also just an increase in communication. So because of just historical stigma and prejudice and bad laws that are now by and large gone away around LGBT people or same-sex couple adopting or fostering, sort of all of those things, a lot of LGBT centers, service providers, other youth-focused works have never really had active working relationships or even initial conversations with the child welfare community or the juvenile justice community or shelters serving youth in their own community. And really, like, they're all, by and large, working with a lot of the same young people and dealing with the same issues, and including schools, and their increasing work on affirming trans students. So we've really seen a lot of value in just calling a meeting and getting all those people together and having a quarterly meeting and saying, hey, what are we all, like the collective we, doing about this? And if you can also figure out a way where LGBT young people can be safely engaged in that work and compensated from their time and active participants, I think that's a huge tool. But making sure that each aspect of like the community and the system is involved, including child advocates and judges and public health folks, like these are community problems or at large, and I think the more you can get all of those people together to achieve systemic reform, the better.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, and thank you all for your participation. Again, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar as well as the electronic copy of the Safe Havens report that includes additional appendix with additional resources and recommended reading after the webinar. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.